Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew Kane awoke in the stark white hospital room of General Hospital, his body still weak and tethered to monitors, but a miracle in the eyes of many. His survival was nothing short of extraordinary. After the life-threatening shooting that nearly claimed him, the tireless efforts of the hospital's surgical team and intensive care specialists brought him back from the brink. In the first hours after regaining consciousness, there was a fragile sense of hope that perhaps, for once, fate had chosen mercy. Willow, shaken but quietly relieved, lingered at his bedside, her expression a mixture of guilt and tenderness. Michael, emotionally conflicted and increasingly isolated, struggled to maintain composure under the weight of suspicion that had begun to gather around him like storm clouds. And Scout Drew's young daughter, who had already endured the trauma of losing her mother, was finally given a glimpse of stability, even if momentary, as she clung to the belief that her father would recover and return to the version of life she once knew. But that momentary peace would soon shatter. The illusion of safety quickly unraveled. The medical miracle that had been Drew's recovery became the prelude to a far more sinister chapter. Anna Devane, guided by both instinct and experience, wasted no time launching her own investigation. Years of intelligence work had taught her to recognize patterns that others dismissed. This wasn't an isolated act of violence, nor was it a random attempt on Drew's life. Anna sensed the undercurrent of something far more elaborate, an interconnected web of secrets, vendettas, and silent alliances that had begun to converge around Drew. She traced the timeline, the inconsistencies in testimonies, and the silent gaps in surveillance footage. Everything pointed to a calculated effort, one that reached far deeper than the initial shooting. Meanwhile, Michael Corinthos found himself drowning in suspicion. Although no formal charges had been filed, whispers had already begun to poison the atmosphere around him. His decision to visit Drew's home on the night of the attack had not gone unnoticed. Tracy Quartermain, sharp and relentless, admitted to seeing Michael's car parked nearby, and despite her complicated loyalty to family, she urged him to find an alibi before it was too late. Even Sonny, Michael's father and a man all too familiar with the shadows of criminal implication, took the threat seriously. He summoned Diane Miller, one of the city's most formidable legal minds, and instructed her to prepare for the possibility that Michael could be arrested if the investigation took a darker turn. The lines between guilt and innocence blurred with every passing hour. Amidst the escalating tension, Christina Corinthos Davis reacted with alarm when she overheard Alexis Davis suggest that Scout might be better off staying with her during Drew's hospitalization. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a reasonable proposal, a stable home for a traumatized child during uncertain times. But to Christina, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Alexis, after all, was harboring a secret of her own. Rick Lansing, her ex-lover and a deeply polarizing figure in Port Charles, was being kept hidden and restrained in her basement, the full scope of which had not yet been exposed to the public. The idea of placing an already vulnerable Scout under the same roof as that volatile secret was unthinkable. Christina's panic was not simply overprotectiveness, this was a calculated recognition of the potential fallout that could ensue if more truths came to light. Willow, too, found herself walking a tightrope. Despite the calm exterior she projected, her name had been dragged into the murky timeline surrounding the attempt on Drew's life. She had been seen in the vicinity on the night in question, and more disturbingly, Nina Ravesh, her longtime rival and mother-in-law, had lied to the police about being with her. The fabricated alibi, meant to protect both of them, was starting to crumble under scrutiny. Portia Robinson, known for her clinical objectivity and subtle insight, noticed the tension in Nina's voice, the evasiveness in her phrasing. Portia wasn't just treating patients anymore, she was reading between the lines of statements, decoding what wasn't said aloud. To her, Nina's account no longer held weight, and she began to suspect that the rift between Nina and Willow was at the center of something far more dangerous than familial tension. The atmosphere at General Hospital, once sterile and orderly, now brimmed with unease. Drew's return to consciousness, which should have been cause for celebration, had inadvertently torn open a deeper conspiracy. Everyone close to him seemed to be hiding something. Anna followed each thread with relentless precision, discovering inconsistencies in the hospital's visitor logs, unexplained gaps in electronic monitoring, and perhaps most telling of evidence of tampering within Drew's medical chart. Someone had accessed his medications hours after he stabilized, and that someone had overridden the system's security protocols. It was no longer a matter of who wanted Drew dead, it was about who had the power to ensure he never walked out of that hospital alive. The line between hunter and hunted blurred with every clue Anna uncovered, and she knew one thing for certain: the second attempt on Drew's life would not be the last casualty if she didn't act fast. Jason Morgan had long been synonymous with danger, precision, and unwavering loyalty, but even he could not remain untouched by the ever-expanding web of violence engulfing Port Charles. When he returned to the mysterious and increasingly notorious Five Poppies Resort, he wasn't simply chasing a lead, was walking into the eye of a storm. Though the mission had begun with the intent to track Vaughn and secure Jocelyn's safety, Jason was met with unexpected resistance. The moment he crossed into the private wing of the resort, an area previously disguised as a dormant storage compound, he was ambushed by an armed assailant. The confrontation was swift, brutal, and near fatal. As bullets ripped through the plastered walls and silence shattered into chaos, Jason relied entirely on instinct. Years of being enmeshed in the underbelly of mob life had taught him how to survive, and this moment was no exception. He countered the attack with calculated precision, taking down the shooter before any backup could arrive. The scene was silent again except for the distant, muffled cries coming from behind a heavy steel door. Behind that door, Jocelyn, Jax, and Vaughn were still captive-bound, bruised, and psychologically unraveling from the trauma they had endured. The room where they were held was void of light, stripped of any humanity, and stank of damp metal and fear. Jocelyn had grown numb to the passage of time, while Vaughn's once unyielding spirit had begun to crack. Jason's arrival wasn't just a rescue, it was salvation. He broke through the electronic lock with the shooter's keycard, burst into the room, and swept them out with practiced urgency. There was no time to comfort, no time to explain who danger was not far behind. The rescue was executed with military efficiency, and by the time they made it back to the rendezvous point, the resort's network had already begun trying to cover its tracks. Files were wiped, surveillance rerouted, and any trace of who had orchestrated the abduction was buried beneath layers of encrypted silence. But while Jason was locked in a deadly confrontation miles away, an even more chilling act was unfolding within the walls of General Hospital. Drew Kane, who had defied death once and appeared to be on the path to recovery, was murdered in the most calculated and unsettling way imaginable. It was not a chaotic struggle. It wasn't loud. There was no alarm. His body was discovered hours later, lifeless in his hospital bed, with no signs of trauma, no distress alerts triggered, and no indication that he had ever been aware of what was happening. The scene was clean to clean. His monitors had been disabled without leaving a trace. The fourth line that had once sustained him had been tampered with, replaced with a substance that mimicked a natural cardiac arrest. The staff on duty were stunned. Security footage from outside his room had inexplicably gone dark during the critical window. It was the perfect crime, excellent, surgical, and cold-blooded. For Anna Devane, this was the confirmation of her worst fears. The attempt on Drew's life had never been about chance or panic. This was a two-phase operation. The first attempt shooting was meant to be public, loud, and conclusive. But Drew's survival had disrupted that plan. The second, carried out inside what should have been one of the most secure institutions in the city, was quiet, intimate, and deeply personal. Whoever orchestrated it had help inside and out. Whether it was a rogue hospital employee, someone paid handsomely to look the other way, or a trained assassin posing as medical staff. It was now undeniable that the killer had detailed knowledge of hospital protocols and timing. What made the act even more insidious was the broader implication. Someone wanted Drew dead not out of blind rage or revenge but necessity. There was something he knew, something he had seen or uncovered in the days before the first attempt, that made his continued survival a threat. Anna theorized that Drew had stumbled upon a piece of a much larger puzzle, possibly something tied to Brennan, the WSB, or the hidden financing network flowing through Port Charles's charitable and political veins. The people behind it were powerful, organized, and methodical, and they were willing to kill twice to silence one man. The evidence, or what little remained, pointed to collusion. This wasn't a lone actor. It was a collaboration link between someone within the hospital who had access to patient schedules, medication logs, and security clearance, and someone outside who possessed motive, funding, and immunity. Anna suspected the combination of medical expertise and institutional sabotage was not a coincidence but a signal of the system-wide rot that had infiltrated even the most sacred places of care. The killer hadn't just slipped in, he had been allowed in. Back at the hospital, chaos unfolded behind closed doors. The staff were ordered to remain silent. Patients were ushered back to their rooms. The floor Drew had been recovering on was closed off for electrical maintenance as investigators swept for any overlooked clues. But Anna knew that time was working against her. The longer the investigation took, the more the trail would cool, and the more the people behind Drew's murder would fade back into anonymity. Jason's return with Jocelyn and Vaughn was a beacon of progress, but it was also a reminder that the enemy was more widespread and coordinated than anyone had feared. The chilling truth settled in. Drew's murder inside a hospital bed was not a failure of safety, it was the manifestation of a system hijacked from within. And if someone could orchestrate that level of execution in a place designed to save lives, then no one in Port Charles was truly safe. Not yet. Not until Anna found the missing link. Not until Jason hunted down those responsible. And not until every person who helped silence Drew Kane faced justice. The moment Anna Devane received the urgent message about Drew Kane's death, she didn't allow shock to settle. Her years as a high-ranking operative in law enforcement and espionage had conditioned her to react without hesitation, especially in situations where silence and precision were used as weapons. She arrived at General Hospital within minutes, her presence commanding authority even amidst the panic already building behind closed doors. She did not need permission. Her reputation and the stakes involved gave her immediate jurisdiction. The hallway outside Drew's hospital room, nowherely quiet, had become the center of a crime scene that threatened to unravel the very fabric of trust within Port Charles. The man who had survived an assassination attempt only days before had now been successfully silenced, not by brute force, but by surgical stealth. Anna's first action was to initiate a full lockdown of the east wing of the hospital where Drew had been recovering. The entire area was cordoned off, and only essential staff and security personnel were permitted to remain. Emergency lights flickered faintly against the sterile white walls, casting shadows that felt heavier than usual. She called for a total retrieval of all surveillance data covering the last 12 hours and demanded that the hospital's internal security logs, digital entry swipes, medication administration records, and electronic chart access be compiled without delay. No one would leave the premises until she had spoken with them. Every nurse, technician, cleaner, and physician who had even brushed past Drew's room was now part of a rapidly growing suspect pool. But the investigation immediately ran into something far more sinister than silence or omission. The hospital's primary surveillance feed for the ICU hallway outside Drew's room, one location that should have captured all comings and goings, had been remotely disabled during the precise hour Drew is believed to have died. No corruption, no mechanical error. It was a deliberate, calculated override. That alone elevated the crime from a desperate act of opportunity to a cold-blooded, high-level execution. Whoever had done this knew the hospital's infrastructure intimately. They had the codes, the timing, and most likely the cooperation of someone on the inside. Anna's stomach churned not from fear, but from the grim certainty that she was looking at something deeper than murder. This was systemic infiltration. As she pored over logs and began to cross-reference timestamps, it became evident that access to Drew's electronic health records had been tampered with. His medication chart had been altered hours before his death. Specific entries were missing, others were written. Dosage history didn't align with pharmacy records, and one batch of IV fluid had vanished from inventory altogether. The toxicology screen would later show traces of an exotic compound designed to mimic the symptoms of cardiac failure, virtually indetectable without a forensic-level screen. This wasn't an amateur's attempt at poisoning. This was assassination disguised as natural death. And it had succeeded. Michael Corinthos, already under the microscope following Drew's initial shooting, now found himself walking the thinnest line between suspicion and implication. Anna had not forgotten that Michael's car had been seen outside Drew's home on the night of the first attack. She had reviewed the digital messages between the emotional, volatile exchanges about custody disputes over Scout and a bitter disagreement about financial entitlements. Michael had motive, opportunity, and a personal stake. But Anna, for all her procedural rigor, was also an expert in subtext. And something about Michael's profile didn't align with the level of sophistication required to carry out what had just happened. She didn't rule him out, but she didn't move on him either. Not yet. Because it wasn't just that the crime had been committed, it was that the aftermath was being shaped in real time. Witnesses who might have spoken up suddenly seemed guarded, detached, or overly rehearsed. Medical personnel gave statements that seemed consistent, almost recited. A few even changed their narratives between initial questioning and follow-up without a clear reason. It was as if someone had either coached them or intimidated them into compliance. Anna wasn't just hunting a killer now. She was unraveling a conspiracy that had infected the very institution meant to protect life. Amidst all of this, Scout Kendrew's young daughter suffered her own devastating collapse. When the finality of her father's death was confirmed, the light in her eyes dimmed in a way that terrified even those closest to her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stopped speaking. For hours, she sat curled up in a chair outside her grandmother's house, staring at nothing, and moving, and blinking. No one could reach her, not Willow, not Michael, not Christina. Alexis Davis, haunted by her own recent mistakes and still concealing the unlawful captivity of Rick Lansing in her basement, tried to step into a maternal role again, gently coaxing Scout to eat, to sleep, to speak. But the little girl had withdrawn completely into herself, locking the door behind her. Anna observed Scout from afar, her trained eyes picking up on the nuances of trauma tremors in her hands, the distant gaze of disassociation, the repeated clenching of her fists as if to hold onto something invisible. And a terrible possibility began to form in Anna's mind. What if Scout had seen something? Or worse, what if someone had gotten to her before or after the murder? In a city like Port Charles, children were not always spared from the darkness. They were often caught in the middle of adult war spawns moved on a board they didn't even know existed. Could someone have manipulated Scout, perhaps unknowingly, to help gain access to Drew's room? Or to keep a secret? Could her silence be less about trauma and more about fear? Anna knew too well how easy it was to underestimate the complexity of a child's mind. Scout had been through unimaginable upheaval, losing her mother, being uprooted from the Quartermain mansion, separated from her brothers, and suddenly thrust into a fragile new family dynamic with Willow. Her world had been nothing but shifting ground, and Drew was the last anchor she had. His murder wasn't just the loss of a father, it was the destruction of her emotional compass. Anna couldn't dismiss the idea that the girl had been targeted emotionally as part of the strategy. Not physically, perhaps, but psychologically, manipulated into silence. If not by threats, then by the sheer force of grief. As Anna stood alone in the observation room above the ICU, reviewing the final report from the forensic pathologist, the pieces began to click in place, not as a finished puzzle, but as the perimeter of something much larger. The methodical way Drew had been killed, the timing of the camera shutdown, the tampered records, the staff statements, and now Scout's complete psychological withdrawal, it all pointed to coordination. This wasn't just the act of someone with a grudge. It was the action of someone who had something to lose if Drew spoke another word. Someone with power, access, immunity, and most unsettling of all, someone still watching. Anna didn't sleep that night. She remained at the hospital, combing through layers of deception, determined to trace the shadows to their source. Because the truth was no longer simply about bringing Drew's killer to justice. It was about stopping the next target from falling. It was about breaking a chain before it strangled everyone connected to it. Drew may have died in silence, but his death had awakened a reckoning that Anna Devane would not let fade into the dark. Not now. Not ever. As the veil began to lift from the grotesque crime that had claimed Drew Kane's life a second and final time, the true weight of what had happened started to sink into the bones of those who remained behind. This was no ordinary murder. It wasn't an impulsive act of vengeance or the work of a single unhinged individual. It was a meticulous, high-level execution designed not merely to eliminate a man, but to eradicate every fragment of truth he may have discovered. The deeper Anna Devane dug, the more she realized this death was meant to issue a chilling warning to those who had dared inch too close to secrets woven into the very foundation of Port Charles. No longer was the investigation confined to the known enemies or the usual suspects. The web expanded with terrifying precision, its strands wrapping themselves around figures once thought immune to scrutiny. Carly Spencer, long regarded as Drew's most loyal ally and confidant, had begun to draw attention for her suspicious absence at a time when she should have been demanding answers. Her grief, though present, was curiously restrained. Her movements were uncharacteristically opaque, and uncovered evidence that Carly had received a call from an untraceable number the night before Drew's death. A call that lasted over 7 minutes and was followed by a complete shutdown of her phone's GPS and call tracking systems. For someone as calculated and protective as Carly, it wasn't impossible to believe she might be shielding someone or something that could have threatened both her and Drew. Then came Portia Robinson. Known for her dedication to the Hippocratic Oath and her apolitical stance within the hospital, Portia had inexplicably filed for medical leave the same morning Drew was discovered dead. It wasn't just the abrupt nature of her departure that troubled Annette, was what she left behind. A review of Portia's login history revealed that she had accessed Drew's confidential recovery notes just before they were wiped from the system. It also appeared that she had used an administrative clearance code not assigned to her. More disturbing was the discovery that she had requested a reassignment just days prior, expressing vague discomfort with her current cases. She cited burnout. But Anna knew better. People didn't walk away from cases like Drew's without reason or without fear. Curtis Ashford's name re-entered the fray with equal measure of uncertainty and dread. Once a trusted collaborator and friend to Drew, his relationship with him had soured over unresolved tensions from their shared past with WSB operations. Though Curtis had kept a low profile in recent months, his sudden and unexplained disappearance in the wake of Drew's second attack could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. He had last been seen leaving a private security firm he occasionally consulted for, only known for handling off-the-record surveillance and counterintelligence contracts. Since then, no bank activity, no phone calls, nothing. And when Anna traced Curtis's last digital footprints, she found a deleted file titled DC Cipher in his encrypted email drafts of files she now believed may have contained intelligence Drew had passed along before his death. But if Curtis had the file, then he was either running for his life or already silenced. Nina Reeves, ever the enigma, had withdrawn from the battlefield long before the tragedy unfolded, but her fingerprints remained all over the political and emotional chaos surrounding Willow and Drew. The secrecy she maintained about her involvement in their affairs was starting to catch up with her. Through a subpoena quietly processed by Diane Miller, Anna learned that Nina had made multiple cash withdrawals over the past 6 months, each under the radar, each amount identical, and all withdrawn from separate accounts across state lines. The pattern was classic laundering. Who was she paying? What was she buying? Silence, forgiveness, or complicity? And yet, these personal betrayals paled in comparison to the larger implications that Anna and Jason began to uncover together. With Jocelyn and Vaughn now safely extracted from the Five Poppies resort, Jason began to cross-reference the timing of their abduction with Drew's first shooting. The results were chilling. Both events had occurred within a 24-hour window of major WSB data movements, transfers of intelligence from black site servers into unsanctioned channels, primarily routed through proxy hubs that had, upon inspection, one horrifying commonality: Port Charles. It was no longer just about local vendettas. The city itself had become a hub for something much darker, much more powerful than anyone had imagined. It was Jason who pointed out the connection no one else had seen. The final location Vaughn had been held matched the same geographic triangulation as a now-defunct WSB safe house used during operations in Eastern Europe. That resort, once believed to be abandoned, had been quietly purchased under an alias months ago by a shell company tied to Jack Brennan, the same man who had become increasingly evasive under Anna's questioning. And Brennan wasn't acting alone. His reach extended into the hospital, the court system, the Port Charles Police Department, and possibly even JH's board of directors. Everything Drew had uncovered pointed to an underground syndicate using the city as a facade for laundering intelligence, executing cover-ups, and erasing liabilities. And Drew had become a liability. Even after surviving the first attempt on his life, Drew's value to them was as a threat, not an asset. What he knew weighed for data he had stored, possibly encrypted somewhere unknown, posed an existential risk to the entire operation. They had to kill him. Not because of emotion, but because he was a single thread that could unravel the entire fabric of their clandestine machine. Then came the moment that changed everything. At 3:12 a.m., An IT technician brought Anna a decrypted clip recovered from a corrupted backup drive. What she saw chilled her to the marrow. The clip showed Drew's hospital room in grainy night vision, timestamped precisely 12 minutes after midnight or the main surveillance had gone dark. In the video, a shadowed figure entered his room wearing surgical scrubs, their face obscured by a protective shield. The person approached Drew's bed and leaned in. No words could be heard, but the monitor showed Drew was awake. Alert. They spoke briefly. Drew reached for something, perhaps a call button, but was gently pushed back. Then, with a single, precise motion, the figure administered something into Drew's forehead. Within seconds, the heart monitor flatlined. The figure calmly stepped back, removed their gloves, and disappeared into the hallway. No one on staff matched the build or gait. No employee had been logged entering the room. Whoever it was, they had ghosted into the hospital and vanished just as easily. Anna watched the clip over and over again, until every pixel of that final moment was burned into her memory. Drew hadn't died alone. He had died knowing. And he had died trusting the wrong person one last time. Anna, Jason, Lulu, and Diane now stood at the precipice of something monumental. Every direction they turned was another dead end, another snare laid to delay, distract, or destroy. But none of them flinched. Because Drew's death wasn't just a closing chapter. It was the opening act of a war against silence, and a war against the invisible forces that believed they could operate in the dark forever. The truth was no longer a distant goal. It was a ticking time bomb, and with Drew gone, the countdown had officially begun.